Hey, so in the previous tutorial, we talked about how we get the data from the phone to the watch and how these kind of buttons get selected, um, you know, and the flow, so to speak, gets created, or the flow selector. Um, and in this tutorial, we're actually going to see how we can create these different screens or different graphical user interfaces and how they switch based on our flow array that we previously defined. And this tutorial is quite cozy related, so I don't know how much classic Mac updates. Uh, where was I now? Yeah, that's right. So how we actually switch between these screens. Um, so you're familiar now with this index.gui. Just a little thing I didn't mention before. The 300 by 300, this is for the Versus, and the standard one is for Ionic. The original development was done back in the days of the Ionic before the Versus came out. So this is kind of the new development. Um, so it's important that you modify both for the two types of screen resolutions. So what I do is this is a little bit of the, I don't know if it's a hack or not, but I basically have all the screens. See these screens that you see here, they're all loaded at the same time. They just have different levels of um, what's the word for it? Um, I forget the exact word for it. It's called da, 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 da. Yeah, the display. They're all displayed to none. So in the kind of standard stage, I take all the views and I map them to the status of none, and I just display the clock face. And that's kind of how we end up here. It's just showing the clock face. So firstly, I have all my different graphical user interfaces. So I have my clock face, I have the indoor outdoor buttons, and each of these are a separate screen. And I pull them through this get element by ID, which, where are we? It's not there, but it exists here, for example. So this SVG has the ID of bright and dim, and I'm pulling bright dim here as a constant. Then of course I convert all of this into an array. So I have an array of all my different views, and then I can map through this array and set them all to none, for example, if I want to hide all of the views. So this is the first aspect that you need to know of. The second thing are the buttons. Now there must be a better way of doing this, but this is currently how we've done it, and I think it could be cleaner. But anyway, I manually define all the buttons that exist. So we've got the comfy, not comfy, indoor, outdoor. So if we go back to our bright dim, for example, situation, I have, for example, my top button, which has the ID of light comfy. I have my left button, which is preferred dim, and my right button, which is preferred bright. I think my light is activated, so we can have a look at that. So there's our preferred dimmer, preferred brighter, comfy, and with the corresponding IDs, the text comes here. So, and it's done here just to create two lines, because otherwise these text buffers are just single line, or they do some word wrapping that's less than ideal. So in my app itself, I actually have to import all of these buttons. There's a little bit of a manual process when you create new buttons, but anyway, it has to be done. And then I'm a little bit guilty of this, but the other kind of hack aspect that needs to be done is these buttons also need to be then included in this kind of JSON of all possible buttons. So here, for example, so I first import the buttons here, and then I kind of give them like a value and an attribute. If someone has a suggestion on how this could be done in a more tidy way, I'll be more than happy to accept your pull request on that. But at the moment, this is how it is. So then we kind of loop through all the buttons, and for each of these buttons, there's an event listener. So if any of these buttons get clicked, then magic happens, which I'll explain soon. Now, if this button happened to be comfort, or have the attribute comfort, which only exists in the comfy, not comfy buttons, which is what you see on the home screen, which are these two, then it executes the flow. So if the buttons have the attribute of comfort, first of all, we hide all these small ones. So as you know, when you click on this, they all disappear, except this one here because of some bug that I need to fix. And then we initiate the collection of feedback data, which I'll get to later. That's for another tutorial. Now we take, or maybe I'll explain this now. So the initiation of feedback data basically starts a JSON, just basically an object where I kind of record the time, which is saved as start feedback, and the heart rate. And then as I go through these flows, I append to that. So I append the button attribute to the button value. So for example, if we go back to our bright dim, for example, the attribute is light. So light then gets labeled as either light, comfy, or prefer bright, or prefer dimmer. Sorry, the value, the string here. And you might see it coming here. So we have start feedback, the heart rate, comfort is what we clicked here. So comfy, thermal, thermally comfy, light, prefer brighter, and then some additional things that come onto the JSON file. And so that's how we kind of store the information. This gets stored in this kind of global feedback data object. And then we switch the flow, which is done by this little lovely line here. Now, if you remember, we had a flow of an array. It started off with show thank you, and then when we read in data through our PSO connection, it appended flows to that flow. So we eventually got an array containing any of these values. Now these happen to be functions, which are defined down here. So show thermal, for example, is this function here. And what this does is I go select all my views. Which are those views? Well, where are they? Yeah, this is the terrible thing of having a single page document, right? My views up here. So I select my views and I set them all to the display of none. So they're all hidden. Then I take the warm cold view, which is the one here, and I set it to display in line. And then I go up in my current view selector. So basically when I click this, everything gets hidden. Show thermal is the first on my flow, so this function gets executed, then everything gets hidden, and then the thermal gets the display is in line. Now what happens is these buttons are activated, right? These buttons are now visible for people to click. So when I click prefer cooler, for example, when we head down here to our buttons, so the attribute of that was not comfort, so this does not get executed because that's only for the start, because the attribute I believe was thermal. And so my selection, the button value, gets saved into my feedback data object, and I now move to the next item on the flow. Now if you remember up here in thermal we iterated up current view, so the moment this gets run, current view goes up one. So the moment the button gets clicked, here, boom, we go to the next item in the flow. And if the item was the last one, remember the last item in the flow is always show thank you. And so show thank you is the final function that gets run. This is a little bit larger than the others. And it basically sets everything to none. It brings our small icons back to life again. It displays our clock face again. It also displays this thank you message. And then also finishes off our feedback data object. So it kind of gives us the time that the last point was given. It calculates how fast the response speed was based on the difference between the start and the end feedback. And finally, it sends the event. There's also just a little timeout of 2 seconds, just so the show thank you screen can, stay on for a period of time for people to actually look at it. Otherwise, it's a fraction of a millisecond. Is it fraction? Fraction. A few milliseconds probably. And then finally we send the data, which, as you remember, I think from tutorial 4 it was, then executes this lovely little thing here where it sends that information, sends that feedback data object to a cell phone where it can then get processed and go to the cloud. So that's more or less in a nutshell how kind of cozie works and managing all these multiple screens. And like I said earlier, if you've got a better way of doing this, I would love to see a pull request. I just don't have time right now to clean this up, unfortunately. Great, thank you so much, and see you in the next tutorial.